We are beginning on marriage and family this week, which is, of course, a subject that is deeply meaningful to all of us in one way or the other. Probably some of our very best experiences and emotions and feelings are associated with family, and or marriage, depending on how old we are, and possibly some of the worst as well for many people. So the point being that it is a powerful, they are powerful aspects of our lives and of our socialization. So the chapter begins with a couple of questions, which is the first one is, what would a genderless family look like? That's something to think about. And one of my favorites is, what makes a quote good marriage? What do we think of as really good marriages? And as you'll see as we move through this, that changes over time. Uh, a lot, actually, what the concept of a good marriage is. So the other thing is, the other question is, how have families changed over time? And how have those changes affected individuals and society? So that's all. Those are all questions we're going to look at in this chapter, because, as I said, those marriage and family are two extremely powerful. Some social scientists argue the most powerful and important institutions in any culture. And of course, anywhere you go in the world, any culture, the idea of gender is extremely related to and very deeply influenced by those institutions. So, from a theoretical approach, it's institutions like marriage and family that actually produce gender. They produce the concept of what gender is in that particular culture. And even more importantly, from this approach, without these institutions, excuse me, gender as we know it would not exist. Because if you want to know something about gender in a particular culture, the best place to look and to start investigating that is within their marriages and families. Because social institutions are patterned behaviors that guide us to accomplishing some particular result or goal of society. And marriage is usually, but not always, seen as the first step in starting a family. There are cultures where marriage isn't, the first step in starting a family, but generally, particularly in Euro-American cultures, of course, it is. It's also a way, of course, to demonstrate adulthood in many cultures. So, by that signal of commitment to another person, it's a very, to be able to make that commitment, you have to be coming from an adult, responsible place. But in some other cultures, it's not so much the idea of commitment as to an individual other person, as it is a way to make an alliance of some sort, as in, for instance, a royal marriage, if you think about that, to make alliances and end wars. And in other times and places, it was more like a business merger, a pooling of resources of families. And that's just a partial list of the reasons that people had the institution of marriage and family and have it still. So, as we know, you should know at this point through the course that social institutions are pretty powerful. And, you don't have to, many of the guidelines in cultures are not laws. They are not written in law, where if you don't follow the rules, you can be thrown in jail or get in real trouble. Many of the times they're guidelines, they're norms. That's called norms or mores. And so you can, you don't have to follow them, but there are consequences nonetheless if you don't. So that's a really important aspect of social institutions, is that they provide their own justification. You don't have to explain why you're getting married, right? Or why it's important to do so in most cases, certainly not in our culture. And the institutions act as pathways through the social world. that are easy to see and follow, and that in the case of marriage you are generally expected to follow, certainly in past generations. And because of the power of social institutions, they're really not easy to change. They're you know their power is intense, and trying to change it, we see that with all the social movements. Most of the social movements we see are attempts to change some social institution in some way. So, therefore, when people try to change marriage, there's usually very passionate debate, disagreement, uneasiness. We've seen that about gay marriage. We saw it about no fault divorce before, that became legal, and a variety of other things. So, what we're going to do is look at how in the past the idea of what's called companionate marriage, at the root word there is companion, right? Buddies, friends, who support each other. We're going to look at how in the past that idea of marriage being a companionate relationship, which is the expectation that spouses have a romantic and sexual attraction to one another, that made a lot of people very nervous when that idea started coming into play, because it was much more those alliances historically that were created between families. Uh, and so more recently, here's another example: the legalization, as I said, of same-sex marriage has caused real unease. And but now, it's legitimized in 32 different countries. So we're going to look at a brief history of marriage. I put up a wonderful video for you. It's a long one, but as I said, I hope I said when I posted it in the comment that you'll watch the whole thing, because it's pretty incredible, and it wraps back around from, you know, how it begins to the ending of it, and ties it all together. So but this is the film that I mentioned, I think before, I can't remember, that has the explanation of romantic love, where romantic love came from, the troubadour and the lady, that type of thing. So it begins there in France, and explains all of that. You'll see the castles and all of that. And then there's an American marriage that they cover, and two indigenous cultures marriages that I think you'll find kind of interesting, because it's a completely different take on marriage. So, what they're referring to here in this history of marriage, and I digress, telling you about the video I'd like you to watch that I put up. Antony and Cleopatra is one of the examples they give you in the textbook. It's billed as a great, quote, love story, but it was really much more of a political alliance between Egypt and Rome. And Mark Antony figured if he could make the alliance with Egypt before Octavian, who became the eventual emperor and who was trying to, they were fighting over the emperorship, if you will, of Rome, that Mark Antony, that's how he got, aligned with Cleopatra in the first place, was trying to get control over Egypt. And so it was political maneuvering for power that killed them, because Octavian actually eventually won, became the emperor, and he would have killed both of them in really horrible and humiliating ways, publicly, of course. So, and Romeo and Juliet is another one. We hold up Romeo and Juliet as this great love story. It really was not. We used to really have fun with this in classes in person, talking about it, because what it actually was a cautionary tale of, this is what you don't do. This is how it all ends up, with both of you dead, if you don't follow the norms of the institution of marriage in the culture. Because Romeo and Juliet's parents were in a horrible feud and had been feuding for generations. And that is not an alliance that's okay to make with a feuding families. So that's kind of how that went. So marriage can be the historical equivalent of a peace treaty if the families or the countries want to do that. That's where kings and queens often, or prince and princesses marry to make an alliance between two feuding or warring countries. It can be a non aggression pact. A trade agreement is a basis for a marriage for countries and powerful families. So the exchange of women, and it was usually women, of course, sealed the deal. And some women, like Cleopatra, used that power to become rulers themselves before, rather than becoming pawns in the game, because she was the ruler of Egypt at the time that she and Mark Antony had their, alliance and relationship. So she did. Then there were a few queens of Egypt, and they also practiced those arrangements of marriage that were alliances. So although women were more often the method of exchange, men also used marriage to gain power for themselves. And we can look back at Antony again, right? He was getting something from that relationship with Cleopatra. She wasn't the only one getting something in terms of power. So now we're going to move on to something called the marriage gradient. The marriage gradient is a pattern in which women tend to marry up, right? And men tend to marry down. We're going to look at some interesting things about that. So what that means is women usually marry men who are older, richer, and usually of a higher status. And I'm going to give you some ages differences here. They're also often, almost always, men are taller than their wives. So there's that marrying up part out as well. So let's look at some of these age differences, for example. And if you think about these men I'm going to mention, you will see that wealth and power are, it's not just age, it's wealth and power that the age represents. So if you look at Melania Trump and Donald Trump, there's a 24 age difference. Well, with the rest of these I'm going to tell you about, that's a pretty small age difference, actually, because Al Pacino and his wife, Noor Alafala, there's a 54-year age difference. With Patrick Stewart and his wife, Sunny Ozell, there's a 38-year age difference. And Alec and Hilaria Baldwin, there's 26 years. So those are extreme examples of marrying up. They're all rich, older men, okay, and powerful men. So what is marriage then? Is it an alliance? Is it, what is it? Well, historically, it was a way to gain power and resources, as I just said, rather than finding a, quote, soulmate, a concept that didn't even exist. So this idea of companionate marriage, the expectation that spouses experience romantic and sexual attraction to each other, as I said, is a fairly recent idea. And it's important to remember that when we discuss the declining rates of marriage at the end of, or the end of marriage as we currently know it. It's important to understand that because we're in a morphing period of what marriage is and what it means and the ideology of marriage. So when people talk about the coming death of marriages as we know it, as the text says, they may be right. It doesn't mean that marriage is going to die. It means that marriage as we know it very well might, or change, so dramatically that it might be unrecognizable to, our parents or grandparents. Another key point is that a social institution is there. It's because it's supposed to give us clear rules about how to accomplish something in society. And one problem today is that in recent years, families have become less institutionalized. And one might say that that's, a good thing. And they're, often kind of made up as we go along rather than, using some established set of rules to follow. People are becoming much less rule oriented. I don't know if you've noticed that or not in general in modern societies. So what are demographics? Because they're very important to this conversation, as you'll see as we get into it. Demographics are a way to describe population characteristics, of a group. And that includes the sex ratio, the number of men to women, age, life expectancy, racial and ethnic groups, those type of things. So one of the most interesting demographic trends related to marriage in the United States recently has to do with its absence. They refer to in the text Rebecca Traister's book called All the Single Ladies. And she talks about the quote, dramatic reversal in marriage trends in the United States in recent years. Because for the first time in American history, single women, and that means never married, widowed, divorced, or separated, outnumbered married women, excuse me. So single women in all categories. They can have been previously married and be widowed or divorced or separated, whatever, or never married, outnumbered married women. The average age at first marriage was 20 to 22 years old since the 19th century, and now it's climbed to age 28. That's the average age now at marriage in the United States. Only 29% of Americans are married by the age of 29. That's pretty amazing when you think about it. 29%, let's round it up to 30, only that percent of Americans are married by the age of 29 currently. In 1960, it was 60% of Americans married by the age of 29. The proportion of young adults who have never been married is now larger than the percentage that have been married. And unmarried women specifically are a quarter of the voting age population in the United States. Now, that is a crucially important figure. 1/4 of the voting eligible people in the United States are single women. So you can see why, uh, you know, political parties are really going after the single women population. So statistically now in the US, it's as normal for a woman to be unmarried as married in the United States. So what are the implications of this trend? Because it's quite new, unprecedented in the last few generations anyway. Tracer, the author of the text, the author of the book that is referred to in the text, All the Single Ladies, traces it back to the second wave of feminism in the between the 1960s and 1970s in the United States. And it's important to point out, by the way, that not all feminists of that second wave were critical of marriage. Some, like Betty Friedan, were more interested in fixing marriage. She wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. And what she talked about was, and it was wildly popular book and extremely influential, but like much of the second wave of feminism, it was, educated middle and upper middle class white women. And so her book was about that, was about the wives who, the house was in Connecticut, the husband worked in New York City, took the commuter train back and forth every day to work. She was alone all day. The kids were in school. She had this beautiful house, money for help, et cetera, et cetera. And she drank a lot when her husband got home. They'd sit around and have 3 martinis before dinner and wine with dinner, et cetera, et cetera. And it was a very empty, arid, boring life. Many of these women had gone to colleges, had gone to very good colleges, but at that point in time, you went to college to find a husband, basically. So they were educated, but they had never really worked and, that type of thing. So that was what the feminine mystique was about. So Betty Friedan, very powerful in the second wave of feminism, wanted to fix that rather than get rid of marriage. So regardless of the different feminist positions, the real legal gains were made at this time due to the activism of the second wave of feminism in the 60s and 70s. And there were many Supreme Court cases and laws changed. So there were great legal gains made that made it possible for women to abstain or postpone marriage. So, for example, In 1972, in Eisenstadt versus Serre, the Supreme Court ruled that contraception could be sold to single women. Now, you may not have known that contraception could not be sold to legal women, to single women legally prior to 1972, but that's the case. Only married women could get legal contraception. So that affirmed the right of the individual, of the woman as an individual rather than as an extension of her husband. So it affirmed the right of the individual, married or single, to make decisions about her or his body. It was really revolutionary at the time when to get married for women meant giving up many rights and freedoms. Judge William Brennan of the Supreme Court said in his ruling, quote, "The married couple is not an independent entity with a mind and heart of its own, but an association of two individuals, each with a separate intellectual and emotional makeup." And that ruling recognized that women's rights shouldn't be curtailed based on their marital status. And believe it or not, that was a very radical idea at that time. And then after that, there was what the text calls a cascade of judicial changes. So Roe v. Wade in 1973 legalized abortions. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act made it easier for women to obtain credit cards, bank loans, and mortgages without the permission of their husband. You could not literally buy a car. I tried. On my own, and they said, "Fine, you want that car? You bring your husband in." You know, and it was the same with getting a credit card. You couldn't get a credit card without your husband signing off on it. So you can see how radical it was in the 70s that these laws changed, which gave women the power to be more autonomous. So in the 1980s, there was, of course, a backlash, a very large backlash against all of these new laws and freedoms for women, and particularly single women, because now there were more single women, because you could operate in society more effectively as a single woman for the first time than you could as a married woman. So President Ronald Reagan argued that some of the main causes of poverty was poor women's refusal to marry. And of course, the subtext of that was Black women in particular. The real target of his anger was poor and minority women. And this is where the term welfare queen came from. The backlash saw the origins, it created the trope of the welfare queen, and the presumption that many of the country's problems were caused by unmarried Black women who upset the balance by having children out of wedlock. But despite the backlash, in the 1990s, the change in women's marriage patterns was in place. It was there. And abstaining or delaying marriage was no longer seen as a political choice. It was just the way things were. So single women, this is really, really, really important. I talked about this a few minutes ago, became a powerful political demographic, because across racial and ethnic groups, it was women who drove the turnout in the 2012 presidential election. Single women make up almost 40% of the African American population voting in that election. They're 30% of the Latino population and a third of all young voters. So single women helped elect Barack Obama, and both Republicans and Democrats have increased their efforts at single women voters to win single women votes. So the demographic increase in single women doesn't mean the end of marriage, because demographers predict that still 80% of Americans will marry at some point, but marrying at much later ages than they previously did. There are significant implications for marriage and for society as a whole when women marry later, as you can imagine. evidence shows it can be good for marriage as an institution. First of all, the people marrying are older, right? They're more mature. So that's helpful. The states in which people marry later, the United States, in the United States, those states in which people marry later have some of the lowest divorce rates in the United States. And there's a table in your book, 8.1, that has that demographic information. So many social scientists think we are living in, quote, the epoch of single women predicted by Susan B. Anthony in the 19th century, the great woman suffrage leader, Susan B. Anthony. That brings us to the marriage squeeze, what's called the marriage squeeze. And demographers tell us that what that is. You used demographics to discover the relative mixture, the ratio of women to men in a given society. So the sex ratio is the number of male to females in a given society. Worldwide, that ratio is 101 men to 100 women. But here's the key point. You would never say that that was true of the elderly, for instance. And we'll see what happens as we age. So the ratio varies by age. The world population of those over 65 is 80 men to every 100 women. Okay, that's a huge difference, isn't it? From the general worldwide ratio of 101 men to 100 women, that's including all ages. You get to 65 and suddenly there's only 80 men for every 100 women. The sex ratio is important in most societies because women marry men and there needs to be enough in each group, available. There needs to be a one-on-one for it to be plenty of men to marry for women. So not enough of one or the other causes what's called a marriage squeeze, which is a shortage of one sex or another. And marriage then becomes like a game of musical chairs. Somebody is going to be left out, right? Someone's not going to get a chair to sit on. And China's a really good example of this. I put up a brief video for you on this because they had a one-child policy that was in place from 1980 and did not end until 2016. So that's a very long time of having a policy of everybody having only one child. Now, there were some exceptions to that. People in rural areas like farmers, there were some exceptions to only one child, etc. Well, what happened was, of course, there's a son preference, S-O-N, male son preference in Chinese culture. And so there were selective abortions of girl fetuses. And then there was low fertility in general for some reason. So in 2010, the sex ratio at birth in China was 118 men for every 100 women. So the number of, quote, excess males is estimated at 20 to 33 million. There's a lot of things on the internet about it, a lot of other videos you can look up. Also, what turned out, they're called the princes, the young princes of this one-child policy, because those boys, you could only have one child, you wanted a boy. When they got one, they were so spoiled. It was just outrageous. In fact, there's some humorous little films about that online on YouTube. So this marriage squeeze, so there's a marriage squeeze, right? There's not enough men to go around for women who are looking for partners in China, for spouses. It's especially important in a culture like China, in which marriage is virtually a universal expectation. So the potential for the marriage squeeze can also occur because of what's called the marriage gradient. So in a group of women and men, let's say ages 20 to 29, not just any man is going to marry any woman and vice versa. Because as we talked about, if women marry up and men marry down, then a marriage squeeze can exist even with a 1-to-1 ratio within an age group if they don't fall into the categories that would apply to marrying up for men and marrying down for women. Marrying down for men and marrying up for women. So it's true due to the fact that men generally marry women who are younger than them and women marry men who are older. A marriage squeeze can also happen because of too many men with lower educational levels relative to women today. And that's one of the major things that's happening today, because women are graduating college at much higher rates than men today. You can look up the statistics for that. So the term marriage squeeze was coined in the post-World War baby boom, because since women marry up in terms of age as well as other things, the very first wave of baby boom women, and that baby boom period lasted from 1946, when the war ended, till 1964. Okay, so the first wave of baby boom women had the choice of the men who were born before them, before the advent of the baby boom. So the sex ratio of the boomers itself was okay, right? But for the women, there were fewer older marriageable men. And it's one analysis of the women's movement that started in the 1960s is that it started because it was a big important factor, because in the 60s there were more unmarried women and they were pursuing higher education and careers and became activists. So some of the interesting and significant impacts of the marriage squeeze are, for example, a country without an adequate number of marriageable men or women experience what's called outmigration of one sex or the other. And that leads to the term is called globalization. It's a diaspora, which is the worldwide scattering of an ethnic group. And this happened with the Vietnamese, actually, after the Vietnam War, due to a marriage squeeze, because there was such a high mortality rate, of course, of Vietnamese men during the war. And then there were high numbers of men who migrated afterwards because the country was just trashed. So in Vietnam, in the ages of 30 to 24, there are only 92 men for every 100 women. So that's the demographics of what's happening with marriage in the modern world. What about the gender division of labor? How does that work? Well, a sense that certain tasks are more appropriate to one gender or the other is what that gender division of labor means. We are all familiar with this. Mom washes the dishes and cooks dinner, and dad mows the lawn and, does stuff involving the garage or the outside. That's the gender division of labor in a nutshell. So, but not always the way the division worked historically was, not always the same. For example, brewing beer was women's work during the medieval period, and plowing the fields is what men did. And in many African societies, men's work was to clear the fields, but it was women's work to plant and cultivate the crops. So when we talk about the gender division of labor, we mean all forms of labor, not just, housework, as I said. There's all kinds of other kinds. So to look at, there's been some interesting studies wondering, is this the same in transgender people or, gay and lesbian couples, this division of labor? So the first one we look at is the transgender families and the division of labor. Because in transgender families, the family members are at least partly socialized into a different gender identity. And so we're going to look at that distinction from transgender to cisgender, because the study was done on transgender versus cisgender couples. So, cisgender, if you don't know what that is a term that describes a person's gender identity, not their sexual or romantic attractions. People who are cisgender may or may not be straight. Okay? So here's what studies show. Studies show that cisgender women in a relationship with trans men have dynamics that are very similar to women in relationship to cisgender men. In other words, they're not equal. Right? They have a gender stereotype division of labor, the one I just referred to. Mom does the dishes and dad does the lawn. However, the respondents in this study didn't want to see it that way, right? They didn't want to see themselves, the transgender couples, as the same as cisgender couples, even though they were doing the same behaviors. Okay? So they refused to think the typical gendered patterns of chores that they were doing, that they said, you know, who was doing what in the family, they refused to connect those to the larger societal gender norms, even though they were the same. It's really interesting. So if you look at this form gender takes in modern family life, it can be, and that's how I just, have now for the third time say mom does the dishes, dad does mows the lawn. How did that come about, those ideas? Well, it can be traced to the doctrine of what's called separate spheres. Okay, so if you, it's hard for us to understand this. The younger one gets, the further generations away from the history of how it was, historically, the harder it is to understand. But before the Industrial Revolution, for most of human history, in other words, the home was the factory, right? Everyone in the family were the workers, and most of the work took place in the home or nearby in the fields or in a shop downstairs or next door. The Amish are in our country are a very good example of this. So if you were a family of weavers, you had there were the sheep that had to be taken care of, the sheep that had to be sheared, the sheep that the wool had to be spun, then it had to be woven on looms. You weren't in a factory, you were at home, you know. And it was lovely in a way because you could do it whenever you felt like it. Now, of course, you had to do things according to seasons as well. But I mean, if you were a morning person, you could weave all morning and then do something else in the afternoon. If you were a night person, you could weave at night, and etc. So you weren't on a wage, you weren't punching a time clock, and you weren't leaving the house to go somewhere to work because that just wasn't there. There were no factories, right? But modern marriage is very, very different, of course. It's an institution that's freely based on love and compatibility, composed of a single male breadwinner plus an economically dependent wife and children. There was no idea when you got to modern marriage that people should get to choose who to marry as individuals. It was too important for that, right? Or if it wasn't too important for people to think about individuals, you thought about other things as well, which your text doesn't talk about, but I want to explain to you. So say you were a young woman and your family were farmers, you lived on a farm, and you were getting to be late adolescence, marriageable age, early 20s, whatever. And there was another farm that was maybe a few miles away, and they had a son on that farm who was the right marriageable age. How did you even know anybody in those days? Well, church was a main place. People helping each other, families helping each other with their harvests was another place. And then there would be, the men would do the harvest, and then the women would bring big picnics and everybody would get together. There were barn dances, etc. That's how you knew people. So say you're this young woman, and you go, I noticed that John, let's say, is really a good worker. Okay? He really works hard on that farm. He helps his dad a lot with stuff. And he's also really nice to his younger siblings. He's not mean. He's helpful to them and supportive. And he's a good guy. He's a good worker. He's nice. I see him at church every Sunday, etc. He's always with his family. Well, what does John think about Mary? She's really nice. She's kind of pretty too, and she helps her mom. And when we have those picnics and church suppers, she always brings something she's baked, and they're good, the stuff she makes, and she makes her own clothes and sews for her younger siblings, and she's really nice to them. I know she does teaching with them. She reads books to them and things like that. She's a good woman. Okay? That's how you chose. It wasn't, oh my God, I saw him across a crowded room and he was just so spectacular. It wasn't that kind of thing. So even when it wasn't arranged, it was based on stuff a lot more than, sexual attraction and romance. Not much romance in that story, is there? So how did this idea we have about romantic love and sexual attraction being a necessity for marriage occur? How did that come about? Well, the idea arose partly from the phenomena of wage labor during industrialization, because it gave young people, more freedom from their parents' influence and more control because they were getting jobs and supporting themselves. And that meant less pressure on young people to make a match that would satisfy their parents. And at the same time that was occurring, industrialization, Enlightenment philosophers began to praise the virtues of individual rights. This is where this whole idea of individual rights started. And what that did was it challenged the right of institutions like churches and the family to dictate who should marry whom. So according to the ideals of the Enlightenment philosophers, marriages should be based on love. And that was a pretty radical change. The radical change in marriage took some time and created a lot of anxiety, as you might imagine. Because for years previously, even mild expressions of affection among married couples was kind of looked down upon and thought to be, was potentially disruptive to the institution of marriage for a smooth functioning of society. Old parents asked, how could you choose a spouse wisely if love were involved? And we go back to the Romeo and Juliet story. Remember, I told you that was a cautionary tale. Now, that was, hundreds of years before what we're talking here about the Enlightenment. But it's an example of how parents were thinking these hundreds of years later during the 1800s about, how could you choose a spouse wisely with your brain rather than with your sexual urges or romantic love, your heart, if you had love as the basis for it. So if marriage was supposed to, quote, make people, quote, happy, what would hold them together if things went badly? Well, here we are, right? It was a valid question, and we know what the consequences are and the results. And then another question that freaked people out at that time was, if intimacy was so important, would women begin to expect equality with their husbands? And here's another question they were asking. If parents, churches, and states didn't make the decisions about who married whom, how could society ensure that the, quote, right people married each other and had children. But, those were powerful questions. There were a lot of debates about them. People were worried about the change in marriage, as they kind of are today. And yet, as we know, the love marriage is now the norm, right? It's considered to be desirable and it's the norm. And not only in the United States, but because of increasingly powerful messages through film and that type of thing, um, now in other parts of the world as well. I put up a little clip about Japanese. There's a whole thing in Japan about having Western or American weddings instead of the traditional Shinto ceremony, which is very beautiful. And so there's a little clip about that. And so now American white foo-foo wedding dresses are all the rage for a large segment of society in Japan. It's kind of very interesting. So the gender implications of modern marriage are obvious in the sole male breadwinner with a dependent wife and child ideal. And even though it's mostly an ideal today, unless you're pretty wealthy, it's an ideal that is still very powerful today. But as I said, very few modern marriages actually reflect that. And it all comes about because of this idea of gender and what's called the doctrine of separate spheres. Okay. So among white middle-class families in the US and Europe, the ideal family was one in which the father worked to support the woman who stayed home and cooked and to take care of the home and children. According to the doctrine of separate spheres, it's a man's duty to be the breadwinner and protector, while a woman's duty is to be a good wife and mother. Because, as we all know, women are kind and gentle, and men are bold, aggressive, and competitive. I was being sarcastic there, but your book says this is the stereotypical at the origin of this idea of separate spheres, that women are kind and gentle and men are bold, aggressive, and competitive. The doctrine of separate spheres is a complicated ideology, actually, and it has very far-reaching implications. The first implication is it marks this idea of two different realms of our social lives as distinctly different and gendered. So home, quote, home, is a safe harbor from, ideally, from the stresses of the outside world, and it's associated with women and femininity. A, quote, haven in a heartless world, which is a quote directly from a poem written in the Victorian times called Angel in the House, which is a very long poem. I was going to put it up for you, but it's so long and in Victorian language. It just lists all the angelic qualities of the woman who is in the home almost exclusively, not in the outside world. So while that's the home, the safe harbor from the stresses, a haven in a heartless world, the economic sphere became an inherently masculine realm. And that was associated, of course, with lower moral standards in this dog-eat-dog world of business and work. So while the home was associated with sentiment, obviously, comfort, the world of work was associated with rationality and competition. And that's a very important separation because it constructed an idea of women as being sentimental and men being rational. Okay. So the public sphere where men operated is, the world of markets and products, and it's very distinctly masculine, and that including paid labor. But it also included all the other institutions that interact with the market, or intersect with the market, including politics, of course. So the private sphere, the home where the woman and the children were, is anything that's not public. Home and family life. It's a place where women belonged. So the doctrine of separate spheres first achieved a gendering of the physical spaces of the institutions of home and work. Okay? Because before that, we just said home and work were integrated. Okay, so that was the first change. This separate place where women hung out and men hung out. The second change was the transformation of how people thought about what it meant to be gendered. Because gendering the institutions of work and home affected the roles that women and men had to play in those institutions of work and home. So it affected the roles of masculinity and femininity. It actually changed the way people conceived of what it is to be a man or a woman in ways that are very difficult for us to understand now because they're so deeply a part of our own gender ideologies. They've become so deeply ingrained and just quote normal for us that we can't really get it how socially constructed they were at this time period. The separate spheres gives us the idea that you've heard this saying a million times: a woman's place is in the home and everything that implies, which is primarily the outside world is not the woman's place, right? So the most important point about this shift is the idea that men and women are fundamentally different from each other. And most importantly, rather than seeing women as lesser versions of men as previously, remember we talked about that in early chapters, that women were not seen as fundamentally different from men in ancient Greece and Rome. They were just, not as evolved as men. They were lesser versions of the same critter, basically. But now, from this separate sphere concept that's so powerful, now they were perceived as almost an entirely different species. Because in the past, a woman could have some independent roles, for instance, as a widow or an unmarried woman. There was a term called a maiden aunt, which was, an unmarried sister of mother or dad who often lived in the same home with everyone else. And the term maiden meant, of course, that she was a virgin because she'd never been married. So under the previous system, before this separation of spheres, there was some overlap between the tasks that men and women performed because women were seen, as the term was, yoke mates, like the yoke you put on an oxen, to pull a plow in the field. They were yoke mates to their husbands because they were all doing productive work. Even if before the separate spheres, much of the work that women did was in the home and much of the work men did was in the fields, nonetheless, they were a unit, a productive unit. So, but with this new doctrine, the separation, women could no longer act in any way that would even suggest that they were like men. So some specific examples help clarify this. Mothers were socially constructed as, quote, the natural family member charged with the job of educating and caring for children because of their qualities of maternal love and superior feminine virtue. The virtue originates in a sense of morality that's superior to men's because the home shelters them from all those worldly struggles of competition, and struggling for success and achievement and, the dog-eat-dog world. So explanations for women's moral superiority also were often biological. Charles Darwin, for example, believed that women were, quote, naturally, that means built in, right? Naturally more tender and less selfish than men. So before the separation of spheres, women were thought to be too overly indulgent to be given responsibility for teaching children, any kind of sound reasoning, and or to restrain sinful urges because women were so overly indulgent that they couldn't teach children about resisting temptation and sinful urges. It was only fathers who were the stronger of the two parents who were capable of the kind of harsh discipline, and you hate to even think of what that means, the harsh discipline necessary to raise a child to adulthood. Now, this was before the separate spheres. But of course, women were doing most of the caretaking of infants and children at this time. But it was the fathers who had the greater responsibility for how they turned out. In other words, prior to the doctrine of separate spheres, if a child turned out badly in some way, it wasn't the mother who was to blame, it was the father. Because child rearing in those days focused on the transmission of patriarchal authority and religious doctrine. There was very little idea that love and caring were necessary. That was kind of considered absurd to most families before the separation of spheres. And that's the reason in divorce, until not too long ago, I should have looked up the date for you, the children always went with the father in the case of a divorce. The father always got custody. That was the practice. In fact, the great novel by Tolstoy, Anna Karenina, talks about this. That's a big part of the whole novel. Anna Karenina is the wife of a count. She falls in love with a young soldier. She goes off and has an affair with him, and the father will not allow her any contact with her much beloved little boy, and she finally kills herself. She jumps in front of a train. So that practice of the father always getting custody of the child was completely reversed, almost completely reversed in the 20th century after the doctrine of separate spheres came into being. So a second way, another way separate spheres affected ideas of gender was in the connection with masculinity and domesticity, because all things that were associated with the home became feminine, but any virtues that were associated with masculinity that stayed in the home were then redefined in some way. Because in the centuries leading up to these changes, of course, domesticity, as we talked about, had been the ideal for both men and women working together in the home. But when men and masculinity were separated from the home, then the meaning of domesticity changed in itself. I'm going to move here to another video because this is getting too long for this one.